Okay, good morning. So the third big name of the Renaissance, Raphael. Raphael is incredibly important because all the academies from the early 17th century on looked at him as being the model of the perfect painter, the standard. He was so perfect in his composition, in the volume of his figures, in the expression and so on, that he really became the model. And in a sense, it's sad to say, it almost killed painting because everybody wanted to copy Raphael. So I'm really trying in this lecture to give you an idea of the context, again, in which he was born and what were the influences. And I'm going to start first with a map of the peninsula in around 1500. And as you can see, we've already talked a lot about that. There was no unified Italy at the time, but it's made of city-state, if we can say. And one of the biggest one is, of course, the Papal State that you see here. And of course, the Kingdom of Naples that goes all the way to the south. I'm emphasizing of that period rest on the Papal State. The reason is the Papal State had all these beautiful little towns
Anne, I can't hear you.
Me either.
No,
I can't hear.
There we are. I should be fine.
Okay.
Okay.
I've lost the video too. Oh, there it is. Okay.
Okay. Sorry, it's we had that last time for whatever reason. It's an electrical issue, so it could be that we had a short. So anyway, we still had that first map, and I'm talking about the Papal States. Papal States, a very large territory, as you can see. To make sure that everything works well, the Pope put the different big town or cities into the hands of what I called vicars. And so from Bologna to Urbino and many places in between, we have these vicars taking care of it. But very quickly they thought, they were doing a good job, and they became kind of independent from the Pope. And during the period of time of the Borgia, and later on of Julius II de la Rovere, we'll see how the popes are trying to recover to make sure that they have the dominion over these cities. Then this is going to be the big dynamic at the time of the birth of Raphael. So before I go talk about Raphael, I want to talk about a very important family of the time. It's the Borgias. As you can see, this is a Spanish family, and the Rodrigo Borja was not the first of the lineage, but the most important at that time. He actually was the nephew of Alonso de Borja, who became Pope Calixte III, but himself became a Pope, and we'll talk a little more in detail about him, as Alexander VI. Interestingly enough, while he was a cardinal, he had multiple affairs, but one particular one with Vanozza, de Gattanei, and had with her 4 children: Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia Borgia, Juan Borgia, and Goffredo Borgia. And these, we will also go through it. So this gives you an idea. In that family, the Pope, who was known for the most corrupted papacy ever, and then his very cruel son, Cesare, the very beautiful and very special Lucrezia. And then we have Giovanni Borgia, who is going to be killed, and then Geoffrey that we don't really talk about. He's the youngest one. So let's look a little bit at the influence of these figures. Rodrigo Borgia was born in 1431 in the Kingdom of Valencia in Spain, studied law at Bologna, and then was appointed cardinal by his uncle Alfonso Borgia, who was known as Pope Calixtus III. He became Pope in 1492 and took the name of Alexander VI. While he was a cardinal, he maintained a long-term illicit relationship with Vanozza dei Cattanei, with whom he had 4 children, as I mentioned: Giovanni, the eldest, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey. He also had children with other women, including one daughter with his mistress, Giulia Farnese. He was a skilled politician and diplomat, but he was also an overspender. He was selling the church offices, which is called simony, and which was one of the points that was stressed by Martin Luther when he wrote his 95 Theses. He was known for his lasciviousness and nepotism. He sought to acquire more personal and papal power and wealth, and often gave some titles and a lot of wealth to the Borgia family. He appointed his son Giovanni as captain general of the papal army, which was the title for his foremost military representative, until he was murdered in 1497, supposedly by Cesare. The other son, Cesare, at that time had been established as a cardinal, but when his brother Giovanni died, he stepped down from the cardinalship and went back into a lay condition. He was known to host orgies in the Vatican Palace. That was actually pretty known. That was called the Banquet of Chestnut. That is considered as one of the most disreputable balls of his kind, with 50 courtesans in attendance for the entertainment of the guests. Apparently, on top of the Pope, who was present, 2 of his children, Lucrezia and Cesare, were there too. He died in Rome in 1503 after contracting malaria, though a lot of people believe that Cesare is the one that poisoned him too. A very nice, pretty family, as you can see. His second son, Cesare, a very important figure too, was educated by tutors in Rome until his 12th birthday. He became a charming man, skilled at war and politics. He studied law and humanities at the University of Perugia, and then theology at the University of Pisa. After his graduation, the father made him a cardinal. Now, at that time, people didn't have to have joined the orders of priesthood to become a cardinal. You could be a layperson and become a cardinal. He has been suspected by most of murdering his brother Giovanni, and after his death, he left the holy orders to become a layman and gain the honors his brother received from their father as a condottiero. He married the French princess Charlotte d'Albret. Between 1498 and 1503, in the name of his father, he went through the Papal States and submitted the vicars. That's what I was mentioning, these people that were taking care of the small states for the Pope. but that had become very independent. So he submitted the vicars of the small states in the center of Italy, like Pesaro, Imola, Ferrara, Forli, Rimini, Urbino. But once he was betrayed by his condottieri, invited them for a reconciliation and had them all strangled. After Alexander's death, so his father's death in 1503, he pushed the Cardinal Piccolomini to become Pope as Pius III, but unfortunately he died just a month after his election. And then he was forced to support Giuliano della Rovere after that one promised that he could keep all his titles and honors. But later, della Rovere betrayed him and became his fiercest enemy. And of course, Giuliano della Rovere is Julius II as a pope. Cesare died in 1507 during a battle at Vienna Castle in Navarre. Now, the third important figure of that family is the famous Lucrezia Borgia, born in 1480 in Subiaco, Italy. That's just a little bit northeast of Rome. In 1493, after her father became Pope, she was married to Giovanni Sforza at the age of 13, which was obviously a typical political marriage. But 4 years later, when Pope Alexander VI no longer needed the Sforza, the marriage was annulled on the dubious ground that it had never been consummated. In 1498, she was known to have had a scandalous relationship with Pedro Calderon. His body was found in the Tiber along the body of one of Lucrezia's ladies. Of course, that was the excuse. The second marriage was to the wealthy young Prince Alfonso of Aragon. But of course, there was another problem. Alfonso's father was the ruler of the Kingdom of Naples at that time. That made the young husband's life really in jeopardy. And although they had tried once to murder him, it didn't succeed. He was then strangled in his own quarters. The third and final husband was Alfonso d'Este, the Duke of Ferrara. And so that's actually the brother of Isabella d'Este. After her father died in 1503, she lived then a life of freedom in Ferrara with her husband and children, and went on having affairs after affairs, actually with the husband, the Gonzaga, the Marquis of Gonzaga, who was the husband of Isabella d'Este. Unfortunately for her, her pregnancies were difficult and she lost several babies after birth. And finally, in 1519, she died 10 days after the birth and death of her last child, Isabella Maria. She was buried in a tomb with Isabella and Alfonso. She was rumored to be a notorious poisoner and became famous for her skill at political intrigue. So quite a family, as you can see. When, as we say, when Pope Alexander VI died, he was first succeeded very quickly by Piccolomini, who was Pius III, but then by Julius II, who became the Pope. That's the Pope that commissioned the Sistine Chapel, etc. So now let's look at who influenced Raphael. Raphael was born in Urbino. And so we first have to look at what Urbino was like as a court. It's a very small town, as you can see. I love that aerial view that gives you an idea that the town that is nestled on a very high sloping hillside still keeps its medieval aspect, if you want. It, though, hosted the University of Urbino that was founded in 1506 and the seat of the Archbishop of Urbino. But what is the most famous is, of course, the Palazzo Ducale that you can see here on the left, that was rebuilt by Luciano Lorana. So there we have another family, the House of Montefeltro. two main names is Federico da Montefeltro, born in 1422, who was nicknamed the Light of Italy, married twice, one to Gentile Brancaleone, but had no issues. She lived for 31 years with him. And then he, and sorry, there must be an error there because she died before Battista Sforza married him. So there's a mistake in the dates. And then he married Battista Sforza, with whom he had 7 children. Unfortunately, as you can see, she died pretty young, but they had a very strong marriage, and she was quite an astute woman who would take care of the administration of the city-state when her husband was out fighting. In 1474, the Pope Sixtus IV gave him the title of Duke of Urbino. And really, Federico made Urbino one of the most extraordinary cultural centers in Italy at the time. He engaged he was emphasizing the principles of humanist education, engaged the best copyists and editors in his private scriptorium to produce the most comprehensive library outside of the Vatican. He also supported the development of fine artists and, for example, was the patron of the writer Cristoforo Landino, who was really important. He's also the one that inspired Machiavelli in his book Il Principe. His son Guidobaldo da Montefeltro followed the trends of his father. He married Elisabetta Gonzaga in I don't have the date actually, probably I would say around 1500, but they had no children, and she refused to divorce him, which would have allowed him to remarry, of course. But in 1502, he was forced to flee Urbino to escape the armies of Cesare Borgia, who was trying to bring back all these cities under the power of the Pope. But came back in 1503 after the death of Alexander VI Borgia. He died in 1508 and was succeeded by his nephew and adopted son, Francesco Maria della Rovere. So as you can see, that makes him a family member of Pope Julius II. He had a brilliant court, just like his father, with Baldassare Castiglione, who actually in the book of the courtier describes the court of Urbino. Also the poet very known at that time, Pietro Bembo, and of course, he became one of the protectors of Raphael Sanso, Raffaello, who we're going to talk about in a minute. So here are the two portraits of Battista Sforza and Federico da Montefeltro by Piero De La Francesca. That portrait, as you can see, the nose of Federico is pretty strange, but it's even stranger that you believe, because during a tournament, he had his right eye gouged out. And so he does never show the other side of his face. But to make sure that with his left eye he could see properly, he decided to have the upper part of his nose cut off. And as we say, this is the first known case of rhinoplasty. So this is a really interesting, this is a double portrait. At the back are all the virtues and allegories that relied on these two figures. And here is by Raphael Sanso, the portrait of a very early portrait of Guidobaldo da Montefeltro. So it is in that palace. This is the famous cortile inside the palace. As you can see, far less stern than the outside of the palace that looks more like a stronghold. But the cortile is beautiful and a very good example of Renaissance, early Renaissance architecture. And this is really was the following the principles of Alberti that really wanted that rhythm, that symmetry and clarity that was so typical of the early Renaissance. So just to give you an idea where we are on the ground floor, you had access to the library, which by the way was at that time open to anyone that wanted to increase its knowledge. Then on the second floor, you had the Sala Pubblica, which was the venue for public events. And also the Salotto, a private place where the prince would grant certain audiences, and also the famous Studiolo. And next to that was the bedroom, which was a ceremonial room, not a private room. What is really important is in all this, this is always very symbolic of what you call the coexistence of sacred knowledge and secular knowledge, of Christian and pagan. For example, you had on the ground floor 2 rooms that were one, the Cappella del Perdone, the Chapel of Pardon, so a very religious room. But next to that, you had the Tempietto delle Muse, the temples of the muses. And of course, there we have that pagan side to it. The Renaissance is really trying to make a syncretism of everything, just put it all together and make sense of it, the religious part and the earlier classical text. Probably the jewel of the
sorry, I couldn't quite hear you. Could you?
The jewel of the palace is that studiolo, the famous studiolo. And here you see an interesting setting which shows you the 4 sides of it all together. But I thought it was interesting because it shows you the magnificent intarsia work, so that marquetry work at the bottom, but then a whole series of portraits on the top that mix again the religious side, some figures of the Old Testament, as well as some important lay figures. And this is the kind of thing that you can imagine the father of Raphael, that we'll talk about in a minute, and other artists that were protected by the Montefeltro had access to it. And these were all images that they would have memorized in their brain, were supposed to extend their knowledge and have an impact on their own production. So the paintings on the top were painted by 2 main painters, Justus of Ghent, which is the Latinized name of Jos van Wassenhoven, who was called to Urbino to paint the portraits. The Flemish were very known for the quality of their portraits. But then also a Spanish painter, Pedro Berruguete, who was a very high quality Spanish painter who also painted the figures. The drawings for most of the marquetry was prepared by Botticelli, Francesco di Giorgio Martini, and Bramante. And then the marquetry was made by the Maiano family, Benedetto and Giuliano, and also Baccio Pontelli. So these are extraordinary work that give you that sense of 3D when it's an absolute flat surface. Just a few examples for the pleasure of your eyes, where you can see this, that little seat there that is absolutely flush with the wood. So you just have a feeling. Cynthia, could you mute yourself so we don't hear you? Here too, the only things that advances is this part, but that door is not open. It's actually flush again with the wood. So all these are marquetry works. Same thing with that instrument, the viola da gamba or the lute, the kind of a guitar and weaponry. But I'm insisting this time on these paintings because this was part of the influence of Flemish painters on Raffaello and his father, Giovanni Santi. On this photograph, you can see that there are some sepia-colored panels. This is because the originals are in the Louvre. And so they've replaced them by a copy, but in the sepia color to indicate that the originals are not there anymore. The others having been painted by Pedro Berruguete. Here is an enlargement of the Saint Augustine that is right now, as you can see, in the Louvre. So I really insist on Flemish painters. As you know, it's one of my pet peeves because they have been underestimated so long. But it is true that Flemish painting had quite a large, first of all, presence in Italy. They were collected by all the courts that wanted to be known for the quality. And so they had paintings by Jan van Eyck, by Van der Weyden, and then other painters like Justus van Gent. So this, what was really important in the Flemish painting was the fact that the attention to details and very strong expression, very naturalistic expression, which was less promoted by Italian painters that were looking at idealizing things. Another really important figure in the life of Raphael and his father, Giovanni, is Piero De La Francesca, who was also one of the favorites of the court until he died, of course, but who not only painted beautiful art, frescoes, as well as panels. This one is, by the way, part of the collection of the Galleria Nazionale delle Marce in Urbino, the famous flagellation that shows you the great interest of Piero Della Francesca into the perspective, as well as the development of the figure as a three-dimensional object, if you can say. While he was at the end of his career, Piero Della Francesca had written two treatises, one on perspective and the other one on the rule of paintings and how to represent bodies. So very important figures who is going to influence a lot the father of Raphael. Another figure, Antonello da Messina. Antonello da Messina, Sicilian painter from Messina, as his name well says, has benefited from very strong influence from the early Netherlandish painters. Some believe that he might have gone to Bruges and met with them in real. He's also considered as being one of the ones that brought oil painting to Italy. And this is one of my favorite portraits, showing the portrait of a man, Il Condottiero. He was known for also that very calm faces and the composition of his paintings. He himself, Antonello, had quite an influence on another very important figure in Venice, is Giovanni Bellini, the younger son of Jacopo Bellini. And I give you two examples here of the Dead Christ supported by the Madonna and St. John, which is still in tempera, which is going to limit, in a sense, really the light and some of the three-dimensional rendering of the figures. And then we see a next work that by now is in oil painting, still by Giovanni Bellini, the famous San Giobbe altarpiece. That really shows a continuation of Venetian and Byzantine history, both with the mosaics in the back. But this shows really now that really assimilation of all these new concepts of the Renaissance, which means the perspective, the volume, the way the light really hits the figures and helps modeling the figures. So we see that, again, these ideas of the Flemish Messina that comes with the oil painting, Giovanni Bellini, and all this are really important figures who are going to influence the father of Raphael, Giovanni Santi. Quite an interesting figure and quite more important than we believe, except he's been quite overshadowed by the perfection of his son. He was born in the Duchy of Urbino, was at first a petty merchant, but then studied under Piero De La Francesca. He became the court painter to the Duke of Urbino and painted several altarpieces. But the emphasis of the court in Urbino was more on more literary than artistic. And in fact, Giovanni Santi was not only a painter, but was a poet. And he wrote a lot of poetry that often flattered very much the grandeur of Federico. But as I mentioned, he was aware of the beautiful works of the North Italian painter, as well as early Netherlandish artists. And he was extremely close to the Montefeltro, so really had great entrances in the palace. So in 1483, Santi's son Raphael was born. And unfortunately, 11 years later, Santi died. But what is wonderful is that Raphael really grew up in that workshop and showed a very early talent, and so was helped by his father. This is another work by Santi, the Christ as the Man of Sorrows, and I put next to it by Dirk Bout, the Christ crowned with thorn, and you can see right away the influence of both, though the Dirk Bout's painting is much more dramatic. He was known for the incredible expressions and coloring that really made you feel incredibly empathetic with Christ. And here's another one of Christ supported by two angels. As I mentioned, he was very successful there, but it definitely is within that incredible context that the young Raphael was born. So a very enlightened court that he took advantage of very much. So here's Raphael Sanso, born in Urbino, son of Giovanni Santi, who was the court painter. At the death of his father, he was already so mature that he went on with the help of some others, but directing the workshop. He became, in 95, apprentice in Perugia and became the assistant to Perugino, another painter we saw earlier. By 1500, he became a master and was at first, as we'll see in a minute, strongly influenced by Perugino. In 1504, he becomes assistant to Pinturicchio and follows him to Siena, where he's going to paint the famous, magnificent Libraria Piccolomini library next to the cathedral, and then to Florence. In 1504, he settles in Florence, where he's going to be very strongly influenced by both Leonardo and Michelangelo. But by 1508, his name is on everybody's mouth, not only because of his extremely beautiful personality, but also for his talent, of course. And so in 1508, he works out to get a letter of introduction to the Pope from his patrons in Urbino, who, don't forget, by that time already is already the nephew of Julius II. And so he is called to Rome in 1508 to decorate the papal apartments, and will be very quickly considered the prince of painters. He is going to spend most of the rest of his life in Rome. He receives in 11 a commission for a more secular subject, the Triumph of Galatea in the Villa Farnesina. Named architect of the new St. Peter's at the death of Bramante in 1514. And then becomes prefect over all antiquities unearthed within or a mile outside of the city of Rome in 1515. And incredibly, in 1520, at the very young age of 37, he will die. A lot of speculation on his death. He had some health issues because the climate in Rome was a very bad climate, as it was surrounded by marsh and therefore by marshes, and therefore a lot of malaria. And so he had bouts with malaria, but it is known that he also loved to love. And he had a mistress he was tremendously in love with, and a lot believe that he just did some excess on that side. And he wouldn't dare talk about it to his doctors. And so they bled him to death, literally. So when he died actually on Good Friday, which was his birthday. And the funeral mass was celebrated at the Vatican. His transfiguration, which is one of the last paintings, was placed at the head of the bier, and then his body was buried in the Pantheon, where he wanted to be buried. He was a keen student of archaeology and of ancient Greco-Roman sculpture. As you will see, he designed multiple tapestries. So quite a figure, died very, very young, was known for an extremely graceful person, very handsome, but very good diplomat. He knew how to talk to people, come close to them, agree, and then do finally what he wanted, really rendered all the figures that wanted to be the patrons, to make sure to include them in many of the paintings and make them look very good. So he was a perfect diplomat in a sense, but also his paintings became, as I mentioned, the standard of perfection. One of the earliest paintings that we have of him is a banner. That was, therefore, it's a canvas painted on both sides. The creation of Eve on one side, they've been separated since. And because it's a banner, it's not stretched on a stretcher. Unfortunately, a lot have flaked off. And so it's not in really good condition, but you can already see the extremely well, how can I say, composed figure for a young man at that time. He was 17 after all. So the next one is the Crucifixion. This is actually the first work that he signed, and it's still very influenced by Perugino. Though he signs painted by Raphael of Urbino, the but the work really takes a lot from Perugino. This is a work by Perugino that is in Siena, and you can see how the composition is very similar, though the figures already show the future of Raphael with a very interesting perspective and foreshortening of the faces. They are more expressive than what Perugino had done. You have a very subtle chiaroscuro in the faces. He always demonstrated an incredibly an understanding of the feeling for proportion. In 1502, 1503, he painted this that was intended for the Church of San Francesco al Monte in Perugia. It was actually at first awarded to Perugino, who actually passed it on to his pupil. Really interesting because it shows still scenes that were common to the Quattrocento, so to the end of the previous century, with the coronation on top. So you have two levels. And then the giving of the girdle to St. Thomas. And you can see here St. Thomas, who never believed what he would see, he only believed what he could see, would not believe the assumption of Mary. And so she came down and gave him his girdle. And so this is one of the miracles, and you see him there. So at that time, you can see they're still pretty separated by that very fine line of clouds, but he's, growing into his art. At the bottom of this, and as typically, you find more improvement into the predella. So at the bottom of that previous painting, there was a predella which has been dispersed. And here you have the Annunciation with a lovely landscape and already that good sense of architecture that is so typical of Raphael. A very well composed Adoration of the Magi, and the presentation in the temple, also again surrounded by a beautiful architecture, which is a departure from the Quattrocento. All his career, he painted a lot of Madonnas, at first himself. They are also very influenced by Perugino. I show you just one example. Very often, Mary has a book in her hand, and in this case, you see both the Madonna and Child with their hands on the book. The book of ours that is open at the prayers of nuns, which is the 9th hour after dawn in the church day. That also, of course, that was the hour of the death on the cross. And so they both are thinking of the future, their future in that thing. But very pretty landscape. Again, this is something that they took from Flemish painters. This was painted also for a convent in Perugia. He was barely 20 years old. Just before he left to Florence, he actually didn't finish it. And then when he came back to Perugia, the year after, he finished it. This is tempera and gold on wood. Shows Madonna and Child enthroned with saints. So a series of saints, and then the angels at the back. Very pretty, but again, it definitely owes something to Perugino. I show you here the Madonna between St. John and the Baptist and St. Sebastian. That was done just about 10 years prior. And you can see that inspiration, but with an evolution anyway. He was asked to paint portraits. We're not sure who that man is. It could be Perugino himself. Some think that it could be Martin Luther, not sure, but this is definitely a portrait that owes everything to Flemish painters. Here is by Dirk Botts the elder, A Portrait of a Man, that shows that very same composition. Once these portraits started coming into Italy, they really loved it. They loved that open window that was giving an additional light to the portrait, and then also that way that the sitter is leaning on the window sill, kind of intruding into your own world. He also worked for the small town Città di Castello that was not far from Urbino. This is a work, the engagement of the Virgin Mary, the Sposalizio, was commissioned by the Albizini family for their chapel of St. Joseph in the work of San Francesco in Città di Castello. So definitely he's looking at some works by Perugino that is in the Sistine Chapel and would have been copied on engravings, by the way. And so you have that similar central building that represents the Temple of Solomon. And in the very front, you have the figure here of Mary and Joseph, where here we have Christ and St. Peter. So just different subject matter, but a beautiful rendering here of the whole landscape with the central temple and all the tiles coming and corresponding to the shapes of having all the floor playing the perspective and helping to size up the figures that are there. And we can guess that beyond the temple, you have a similar composition. Also, instead of having the figures lined up with Perugino, we have that roundness that also is reproduced with the figures being set in a circle. Now, very clearly, he believes in himself. He signs it on the building here, the name and the date, Raphael, and the date of 1504. So this is really, we see that quick evolution of the figures, the beautiful figures, the softness, the serenity. Most of Raphael's paintings really breathe serenity and harmony. The Madonna and Child is the time where he really departs now from Perugino. He is by this time getting into Florence, and he's going to have a chance because he had very quickly accesses to everybody in Florence. He will have access to the few paintings by Leonardo, the understanding his sfumato, as well as looking at the few works by Michelangelo and understanding there his analysis of the anatomy of bodies and pushing the composition to an extreme, giving a real tension to the bodies that Raphael is going to soften, but he will definitely use that too. At the foot, the NCD altarpiece uses as patron saint Saint Nicholas of Bari and St. John the Baptist. So the chapel was dedicated to St. Nicholas of Bari. And so what you see here is the saint with the 3 golden balls at his feet. By the way, which is the origin of the pawnbroker sign. But they represent the bags of gold that the saint donated as dowries to 3 poor girls. This is one of the great miracles of St. Nicholas of Bari. And where St. John, is dressed with the tunic, the tunic that he wore, the camel tunic of his desert sojourn. He also has that beautiful crimson prophet's cloak, because he's the one, as you can see, he's pointing his finger at Christ that announced the arrival of Christ. Now, coming from the class of honor on the top, you see these red beads that, of course, represent the blood of Christ in his future passion. One of his first chef-d'oeuvre really works is the entombment. The entombment that he did after an absolutely horrible story that happened in Perugia. In the early part of the 16th century, there were violence among factions. I'm a little bit looking at the US right now, and this was mostly in the form of hand-to-hand combat. It was rather common in Perugia and in other cities in Italy, such as Florence. The family in charge in Perugia was the Baglioni family. They were the lords of Perugia and the surrounding areas. They were also leading condottieri. And it was, there was an especially bloody episode in Perugia on the night of July the 3rd, 1500, when Griffonetto Baglioni and some of his members of the family that were really angry towards the rest of the family conspired to murder the rest of the Baglioni family as they slept. And this was just the day after a very beautiful wedding that had enjoyed the whole city, that had really marked the whole city with joy. And so that terrible event happened. But following the bloodshed, the mother of that whole family, Atalanta Baglioni, refused to give her son the refuge in her home when he returned to the city. And he was then confronted, being outside, by the head of the family who had survived the night by escaping over the rooftops. And at that time, Atalanta changed her mind and rushed to try to save her son, but arrived only in time to see her son being killed by Gianpaolo and his men. And she's the one who commissioned then this entombment. Raphael decided not to show really an entombment, but more the carrying of the body by people. And this, in many ways, was a representation of what happened with the body of the Griffonetto when he was killed, where he was carried back by his friends towards the house of Atalanta. So this has a lot of historical context. Even the figure here is supposed to be a portrait of one of the relatives of Griffonetto, who is here, represented by Christ, of course. It's an extraordinary piece because it is represented in many different ways. It is inspired by works such as the work of Rogier van der Weyden, The Descent from the Cross. These many works of Rogier van der Weyden were in Urbino and in Florence. Also the Perugino, The Mourning of the Dead Christ. And we will see in the preparatory drawing how Raphael evolved towards his work in 1507. He also had seen the work by Michelangelo of the Donny Tango that was in Florence, and where we have that particularly interesting torsion of the body of the Virgin who is trying to grab her son who is on her shoulder. And you can see the reproduction of that torsion in the figure here on the very right of that person, that woman, probably one of the Marys, who is turning around to try to grab the collapsing body of the Virgin Mary. Here are the drawings that really led to that work. And we see the changes of Raphael with an early drawing here with the Lamentation, where the body of Christ is on the floor and everybody is crying and grieving over the dead body. Then a couple of years later, he did that entombment drawing showing the body being carried. And this is all to be done then with the final drawing that has still been changed, because as you can see, the face of the man there has been corrected to a much younger person. But you have an idea now of the end product of the entombment. Again, portraits, yes, he was known for being a wonderful portraitist. This is the portrait of Agnolo Donny and Maddalena Donny, made a few years after they got married. But you can see how you have an inspiration, particularly with her, of Leonardo da Vinci, the perfect triangle that you can see that marks that composition. The way the hands are crossed over one another, the landscape, though the landscape is far less invasive than the one you have with the Gioconda. So the Mona Lisa has been definitely an inspiration, but not completely. Raphael is also moving by himself. By the way, these two were actually at first hinged. And so this was the typical way the portraits facing one another would be shown, where they would be closed and then open for people to enjoy the beauty of the work. Still, he had a lot of demands for virgins. I show you just a few. The Belle Jardinière, the Virgin and Child with St. John the Baptist, which is absolutely wonderful. You have that softness of the face. He has definitely a standard for the beauty that he uses for all the Virgin. And then you have Christ looking at his mother and using a torsion that was known by Michelangelo, and then the little John the Baptist kind of looking at him and knowing that he's going to end up on the cross. The bodies and everything really becomes quite free with the way Raphael works. This painting has an interesting life. It was commissioned by a Sienese nobleman, Fabrizio Segardi. And it was acquired then by Francis of France. That's why it is in the Louvre. Francis knew what he was getting. He was a very good art collector. Another one here is the Madonna and Child, also known as the large copper Madonna. And here we still see some influence of Perugino. But again, we have a kind of a grace and an expression that are unique to Raphael. He is definitely taken from Michelangelo, the larger forms, so very well-formed figures. But the soft modeling comes from Leonardo. So on this, I'm going to take a break. We'll talk about Julius, and I give you 10 minutes to go stretch your legs, get a coffee. Let's say maybe 7 minutes. I like that 7 for whatever reason. And please unmute yourself if you have questions or if you have any comments. Unmute yourself. Tell me something.
The Tondo by Michelangelo, wasn't
Yes.
that for the couple that Raphael painted after you were showing their
Yeah,
pictures?
it's the same family. It's the same family, but it probably is the same people. It's called the Donny Tango.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's the thing is, when Raphael came to Florence, as much as the Florentine were normally keeping for themselves, because he had such good references, he was almost right away invited everywhere and was able, go to the Donnies, he would see all these works and these collections. So that's why for me, it's been really interesting to work on Leonardo and then Michelangelo and then Raphael, because they are such different personalities that I'm looking at Raphael, and to me, it's really interesting. Raphael is almost too perfect. He is so perfect in everything he does, in his personality. When you think of Michelangelo, that we just saw before, who is always in trouble, who is always melancholic, who is always angry. And here we have the perfect guy smiling, going around, loved by everybody, including the Pope. So
I have to wonder if Mrs. Donny liked her portrait, because he gave her that, and I'm sure it was on purpose, because like you said, he was really skilled. He gave her this look on her face of kind of like scornful, like little.
No, but this is not forgotten yet. They were some of the top families in Florence, which means they had to withhold a certain aspect of superiority. So this is not the time to be full of charm.
Oh, I see.
And
so,
if I may have a question.
Yes, John.
In Raphael's paintings of the flagellation of Christ, other painters you showed before, they never show the flagellation by Roman soldiers. They show by, like this one you showed, the last one, they are like domestic workers by the clothes. What was happening? What was happening in history for them to avoid?
Yeah, it's really difficult, because if you remember, we have one by Mantegna that we saw some months ago, and that was, if I remember well, they were Roman soldiers, but it's difficult to know, because were they soldiers, they probably were people that were not really within the army, but that were workers around there. That was not a nice job to do, to flagellate, I'm sure they were full of blood and so on. So it could have been given to some workers in the palace, people that were supposed to do one thing or another, not especially soldiers. Soldiers were there to fight, but not to do this type of job.
Okay.
Did the medieval Romans have any sense of identification with the ancient Romans, such that they might have preferred to see somebody else doing the flagellating rather than a Roman soldier? Huh?
The big thing is, don't forget, at that time, all the blame doesn't go on the Romans; it goes on the Jews. The whole blame of Christ's death goes on the Jews. They carried them with them centuries.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And the Romans, because the church started in Rome, Peter and so on, they had to go gentle on the Romans. You didn't want to blame, start and have a flourishing church if you were blaming the Romans. You were in Rome. Yeah. So that's one of the reasons why they actually blamed far more the Jews because they were far away, but they kind of forgot that the Romans had something to do with it.
Maybe they would rather see in a painting somebody else doing the flagellating, not a Roman.
Exactly, exactly. So they were very, you know, during the medieval times, they had so many things happening. It's the Renaissance that really brought back that pride of the ancient Rome. And that is the basis for the Renaissance in Italy.
Wow.
When you see they all go and look at Roman sarcophagi, they look at Roman statue, they're really trying to reinvent the glory of Rome.
You know, this is something I never thought about. The Renaissance was an attempt to recreate the glory of the ancient Roman Empire.
Yeah, very much.
Ha.
And yeah,
Great.
and that's why it's so, and I tried to really stress it when I was showing, but when you see where the very early Renaissance starts, they go to Pisa. Pisa was one of the cities and a harbor that had been very much appreciated by Rome. And so it had all kind of beautiful Roman monuments and as I say, sarcophagi and columns and statues and so on. They would go there to look at that because that was the pride of Rome. And so they brought that back to Florence. Excellent. Because Florence during the Roman time was just a castrum. It was a little military camp. It had nothing famous, whereas Pisa at that time was a very pretty nice Roman city.
Good.
Yeah, but you know, you find that the whole time of the Renaissance, all the rulers in France or whatever try to find a glorious past that they can try to link themselves to justify who they are now.
That's a great piece of history. I never made a connection in history books about this idea.
Yeah, you know, all the big leaders in the north, the Dukes of Burgundy, the kings of France, and so on, and in England the same thing. They commissioned series of tapestries that were showing the most important rulers of the past, and they tried to find an imaginary line that linked them to these, to show that they were just the inheritors of authority and that they were legitimate. So you have them going back to Aeneas. You know, that you had that already with the Roman emperor, but then they go further, and in the Renaissance they say, oh, but my ancestor that goes back to Rome is Aeneas. And so they go back to these, and so they surround themselves with the War of Troy, of the portraits of the different Charlemagne and Caesar and Alexander, all that to show that they were just the successors to these great figures.
Cool. Yeah. Great. Thank you.
So no, this is really interesting. Okay, we're going to go back. So I'm going to mute you all, or mute yourself if you haven't. Let me see. Mute you all, and we can talk at the end. Okay. So when Raphael comes to Rome, he is welcomed by Julius II de la Rovere. As you know, he was born Giuliano de la Rovere. He is, in his life, organized the Swiss Guards that are still present at the Vatican. He expelled France from Milan and Florence and became known as the liberator of Italy. He was known as the warrior pope because he literally would go on his horse, jump on his horse, and lead his army to try to defeat these other places, successfully or not, by the way. He collected antique sculptures, including the Apollo Belvedere. He established the Vatican Museum. That's going to include the one we just talked about, as well as the Laocoon, which is going to be discovered in 1505. he is going to be a reformer and really encourage a new visual language. His office followed the imperial model. He was looking at the emperors, the Roman emperors, and he tried to follow a similar model. His favorite architect was Donato Bramante. As far as the Vatican was concerned, he added the Belvedere courtyard, which really enhanced the comfort in that otherwise rather stern building at that time. He also initiated the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. The old St. Peter was falling apart, and it was going to cost more to try to refurbish it than building. And they wanted also a bigger church because there was a lot of pilgrims coming to Rome, and pilgrims meant money. So you have to look at the commercial side too. He also, if you remember, commissioned a tomb for himself for Michelangelo, which was the disaster of Michelangelo, and forced the hand of Michelangelo to paint the Sistine ceiling. He also commissioned Raphael for the Stanza De La Signiatura and the Stanza del Diodoro. So once Raphael arrives in Rome, his life is going to change. You don't have the rather easy life that you have in Florence. Rome is not an easy place because you have typically a big rivalry between Julius II and the big families in Rome, like the Colonna or the Orsini. But because of the quantity of work that is going to end up filling his books, if you want, by 1513, so he arrives in 1508. By 1513, he had a workshop that built up to 50 pupils and assistants. This was the largest workshop team assembled under any single old master painter. The only one that will rival him in the 17th century is Bernini. But what is very interesting is that many of his assistants became significant artists in their own right, and we'll meet many in the coming weeks. Giulio Romano is the one that is the most known, but also Gianfrancesco Peni, who is going to go with his brother to Fontainebleau in France. Giovanni da Udine, who will be specialized in decorative stucco work. Lorenzetto, who was an architect and sculptor, and even the Flemish painter Bernard van Orle is going to work for a short period of time with Raphael. And so many of Raphael's later frescoes and some of his easel paintings are notable for the design by Raphael, but the execution was by his assistant. Literally from 1513, there are very, very few paintings that are made by his hand. So the first work that he will receive a commission for is that famous series of stanze in the Vatican Palace. Now, he's faced with different problems when he arrives. All these rooms were in the process of being painted by other painters. And Julius, when he meets Raphael, for so much, he gets so engrossed with his personality and his art that he's going to tell the others, just let go, don't do anything, we're going to paint over it. You can imagine how unhappy these people were. And there some very known painters of the time, like Sodoma and some others that we'll see later. But Raphael was smart. First of all, when he arrived, he comes to Rome, he knows barely anyone. And he doesn't have the assistance around him that he really needs. Doing frescoes on that scale is not an easy thing. And he's going to be very smart. He's going to look at the work that is done and say, you know, we can keep that. I'll just fill in these medaillons with my own painting. But what you've done is fine. And little by little, he's going to collect many of these painters as Sodoma. And he's going to ask them to help him too, and they'll join him. He's also known to have been very skilled at talking to people, at making them, at literally helping them progress in their skill, and help them work together. And so his workshop became a really nice place to work. He also was struggling, and we'll see that in that first room, the Stanza De La Signiatura, he is at that time working mostly with people that were in Florence or even in the Marsh, in Urbino, that came to help him prepare that whole room to be able to paint the fresco. And he's using at that time formulae that were okay for the marshes or for Florence, but not good for the climate in Rome. That was a warmer climate and very humid. And so they still have problems sometimes with these paintings because the formula they were using to put together the fresco was not the proper formula for a Rome context. So this is just a little technical side to it. I show you the two views of the Stanza de la Signiatura, which is a study in which the Signatura Graciae Tribunal was originally located. And that's where Signatura, being the signature, of course, this is where the Pope would sign his edict after going through a trial or whatever. The first, what is really important again is that the whole idea, the whole concept is to bring into harmony the spirits of antiquity and Christianity, very much a symbol of the humanism in the Renaissance, where they have the very strong current of the religion, but they have all these beautiful classical works that have been recovered from ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and that were holding magnificent ideas, and they try to make them compatible. And this is really what they're going to work on, and try to show that they're not incompatible. You just have to look at it a different way. And so in this room, you have that harmony of the spirits of antiquity and Christianity. The studies of humanism really emphasize theology, philosophy, poetry, and justice. And this is exactly what we'll see in this room. As we've seen before, they had parallel in the four elements making up the universe: air, water, fire, and earth. And so this is what you find with all these allegories in the room. So the first composition that Raphael executed in 1509 is the so-called Disputa, or Disputation of the Holy Sacrament, which is actually an interesting traditional name for what is really the adoration of the sacrament. And that's the scene that you see here. Then at the end of 1509, he started to work on the opposite wall, which is here, the School of Athens, and that shows the truths acquired through reason. And that's really the difference between humanism and pure religion, where you have faith in religion and you have the truths acquired through reason with philosophy. And then we have the third composition here, which is Parnassus, with the dwelling place of Apollo and the Muses. And then the two scenes on the fourth wall that we see there, showing the cardinal virtues. And this is mostly workshop. So let's start with the Disputa, portrayal of the militant church at the bottom, so the people that make things, and then the triumphant church on the top. This is the revealed truths of the origin of all things. In other words, the Trinity. And this cannot be apprehended by intellect alone, which is philosophy, but is made manifest in the Eucharist. And everything surrounds that monstrance that you see here on the altar. Everything is built around it. So on the top, you see God the Father, that is based in heavenly light. So just below him is Christ. The resurrected Christ sits on the throne of clouds between the Virgin, who's bowing in adoration, and St. John the Baptist, who points to Christ, as we've seen it regularly. And then the prophets and saints of the Old and New Testament surround them in kind of a half circle and carried on by clouds. At the bottom of the pictures, you have a very large landscape, and this represents the church which has acted and continues to act. And according to the 15th century tradition, he puts portraits of famous personality. Raphael puts portraits of famous personalities, both living and dead, among the people of the crowd. So you can see here Bramante, that is leaning on the balustrade at the left. Next to him, the young man that you see there is actually the new leader in Urbino, Francesco Maria della Rovere. The Pope Julius is visible on the right and personifies Gregory the Great. Sorry, he's here, he's sitting here next to the altar. And then have interesting things. You have Dante, the figure of Dante, distinguished by a crown of laurel, and even Savonarola, which is quite interesting. Why would Savonarola be present there? And it is because he had been reinstated by Julius II. So very clear and simple representation. Here is a view of Christ, all very pretty, always with Raphael. Across from there is the probably more famous School of Athens. Which is the depiction of philosophy. So the scene takes place in the classical time, as both the architecture and the garments indicate. So you have the beautiful coffered ceiling with the arch. Then, but it also, by the way, represents the arts. So you have Apollo and Minerva in the shown in statues in these niches. The figures represent each subject that must be mastered in order to hold a true philosophic debate, which means astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, and solid geometry. So in the center, of course, we have Plato and Aristotle. And as we said before, the School of Athens represents the truth acquired through reason. So he puts all kinds of great thinkers together, but often gives them the appearance of contemporary figures. Plato takes the features of Leonardo da Vinci, and Aristotle, not everybody agrees. Bramante is representing Euclid, and in the back here we have Raphael and Sodoma that represent themselves. We have all kinds of other great figures representing rhetoric and dialectic. Here we have other great figures. And then in the middle, this is Diogenes, of course, leaning on the steps. But this is an addition, a later addition. And the story goes that when Raphael was in the Vatican, he was dying to see what Michelangelo was doing in the Sistine Chapel, and was able, despite the orders of Michelangelo, was able to peek into the Sistine Chapel, and he was absolutely in awe of what he saw in the Sistine Chapel, and had that repent at the end to add Michelangelo as Heraclitus in the very center of his paintings, and actually showing Michelangelo in that typical melancholic attitude, leaning on his hand, as we knew he was a very Saturnian character. Here is a detail of Plato and Aristotle. Probably Pico della Mirandola, and probably Francisco Maria de la Rovere. Raphael and Sodoma. And for those, and of course, Michelangelo. The third painting represents Parnassus. And of course, there we have the home of poetry, the dwelling of Apollo and the Muses, according to classical myth. So the Mount Parnassus is shown here like the hill of the Vatican, where actually in the ancient time, on the hill of Vatican was a shrine to Apollo dedicated to the arts. So Raphael is going to look to represent this to a lot of the sculptures that were part of the collection of the Pope, classical sculpture in the Cortile. You can see that Apollo plays the lira de braccio. Of course, didn't exist at the time of Apollo. And he sits under a laurel grove with the 9 muses who personify the 9 types of art. You can see the theater there. And then we have again all the great figures, including Dante, Horace, Ovid, Sappho, Petrarch, Boccaccio, and Ariosto. So all the great names. And then finally, in the last panel, we have the Emperor Justinian receiving the Corpus Juris Civilis here on the left, Pope Gregory IX approving the decretals on the right, and then on top you have Fortitudo, Prudentia, and Temperantia. These are the virtues of justice, by the way. And this wall was mostly painted by a workshop. In the ceiling that had been already painted by Sodoma, Raphael was really nice and said, it's okay, we can leave everything. I'll just repaint these 4 medallions that represents philosophy, poetry, theology, and justice. In the next room, the Stanza di Eliodoro, that was started almost immediately after that. The cycle was painted between September 1511 and 14, and not to forget that Julius died in 1513. And so it's under his successor that he will complete, the successor of Julius the second. It's Leo X, who is a Medici, son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who he will complete. The program is not a traditional one. They were developed especially for this Rome and for Julius personally. The general theme is God's intervention in human destiny. And it's represented through 4 stories, 2 from the Acts of Apostles and the Apocrypha. The expulsion here of Heliodorus from the temple, the liberation of St. Peter on the left, the meeting between Leo the Great and Attila here, the large lunette, and then the Mass at Bolsena, which is in the other one. The expulsion of Heliodorus is probably the most striking of all of them. It shows that terrible scene where the soldier Heliodorus wants to invade the Temple of Solomon and request that the treasure be given to him. And at that time, you have 3 angels coming in. These are angels without wing that you see, one on the horseback and the other one arrive and are terracing Heliodorus. And you can see the treasure is being toppled on the floor. It's a very powerful scene, but that is extremely well adapted to the architecture of the room with that kind of lunette shape. And then we have, rightly so, we have the Pope Julius II who is seated there and becomes really a witness of that miracle, of the intervention of God. As you can see, for example, the 2 angels, their feet don't touch the ground, which really makes it the miracle. Otherwise, it would have made it just a fight. The liberation of St. Peter, of course, in the New Testament, we know that King Herod took Peter prisoner and intended of having him killed. Then he was chained to 2 guards, but the angel of the Lord freed him despite the close watch. And we see here how the angel comes in, liberates him, and leads him outside. And it's a beautiful representation. It's actually lots of foreshortening, really action. That is almost kind of a movement towards the Baroque era because of the tension. Yes. The Mass at Bolsena is another exceptional work. It represents a Bohemian priest troubled by doubts about the doctrine and of the transubstantiation, which is the idea that when, after the consecration of the host, that Christ is present in the host and not just a representation. And so it shows that during the consecration, the Eucharist began to bleed. And each time he wiped the blood away with a cross of blood would reappear on the host. So this shows, again, we have the Pope kneeling in front and having that doubting priest on the other side. And of course, contemporary figures attending that miracle. The meeting between Leo the Great and Attila are, as well as the Mass at Bolsena, were mostly workshop work. It shows the Pope Leo I that managed in 452 to halt Attila the Hun, on his way to invade Rome. And so he went and talked to him and convinced him to stop there. Of course, the figure of the Pope is a portrait of Leo X, making it a more contemporary image. Actually, it was supposed to be Julius the second, but by that time Julius had died, and so its successor features that are represented. And again, we have here the ceiling that shows scenes from the Old Testament, the theme being God's intervention. So Moses and the burning bush is above the fresco of, yeah, so here we have Isaac and Noah's dreams. No, that's Moses and the burning bush. And here we have Jacob's ladder. And here that's the dream, Jacob's dream, Noah's dream. Yeah, sorry. Other commissions are going to really come from right and left. He becomes so successful, not only again by the perfection of his art, but by his personality. So he gets so many commissions that he cannot do anything without having a very large workshop, which we see he's going to do the Cappella Chigi. That's in Santa Maria del Popolo. He's actually here responsible for the architecture. So this is where he's going to start using some of the experience of his assistant that were architects, and he's going to develop that sense of space that is so beautiful. And here the beautiful cupola with the 4 pendant shafts that adapt the round shape to a square crossing. The Palazzo Pandolfini, which is going to become very much the type of architecture he will be known for. And then we have to have a quick word on Leo X, who is going to succeed Julius II in 1513. He was born Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici. He granted indulgences to reconstruct St. Peter's Basilica, which means he told monks and priests to go around Europe and try to collect money by selling indulgences that were ultimately going to feed the reconstruction of St. Peter. He's also going to reorganize the Roman University. And he is the last pope not to have been in priestly orders at the time of his election to the papacy. He will go on with his work in the stanzas. So he will give Raphael the commission to go on. And so the third of these rooms, the Stanza dell'Incendio di Borgo, is going to be painted between 1514 and 17 by Raphael in his workshop. And definitely there we see that the scenes depicted relate to the new Pope. 4 episodes from the history of the church during the Carolingian age, so in the Middle Age, each of which has a Pope named Leo represented there. And so we have the fire in the Borgo, the Battle of Ostia, the Coronation of Charlemagne, and the oath of Leo III. So here's the Battle of Ostia. in AD 849, the Arab fleet attacked the papal forces, but was destroyed by a storm. And so on the left, you can see the Pope Leo IV in the figure of Leo X, of course, can be seen giving thanks to God. And this is work by workshop assistant. The most important is probably the fire in the Borgo, the most complex of all these. It's full of reference to classical antiquity, to medieval architecture also, and to themes that were used by contemporary artists. So it celebrates the intervention of Leo IV that you can see here at the Loggia of the Vatican, when there was a terrible fire that spread through the Borgo, which is one of the popular sections of Rome near the Basilica. And thanks to his intervention, the fire was extinguished. So you can see this takes place in 847. It's really interesting how you see people being carried. You can see this is a direct allusion to Aeneas, his father, and Anchises, and his little son, Ascanius. Sorry. But very striking is that figure, which is escaping from the fire and is hanging there, the absolute marvel. Anatomy of that very muscular body is definitely owes something to Michelangelo. And then you have all the beautiful figures of women, and then people bringing water to extinguish the fire. So we see this evolution of Raphael being by now quite an illustrator. You see also the woman giving her baby to that other person there. The Coronation of Charlemagne. He was crowned by Leo III in AD 800 in the Vatican Basilica. This is also a workshop, made by a workshop, and you can see the audience made of all the cardinals and then companions of Charlemagne. And finally, the oath of Leo III. He takes the oath of purification at the altar of St. Peter in 800. And you can see again the figure. This represents the features of Leo X. He will not be restricted to religious composition, but also some mythological. So here we see Raphael as well as Sebastiano del Piombo, who was quite a great painter on his own, but received that commission for the Loggia di Galatea in the Villa Farnesina. On the left, the story of Galatea is that she was adored by the giant that you see here on the left, and was running away from him because he was really chasing her. So this painting is actually painted by Sebastiano del Piombo, but it is the Galatea, which was the composition by Raphael, as you can see, the voyage of Galatea. This was commissioned by Agostini Chigi, who was one of the great actors, if you want, in the cultural and artistic activities that flourished around Julius II. The subject comes from a verse from a poem by the Florentine Angelo Poliziano that actually had already influenced Botticelli, The Birth of Venus. So in the lines describe how the clumsy giant Polyphemus sings a love song to the fair sea nymph Galatea and how she rides across the waves in a chariot drawn by two dolphins, laughing at this uncouth song, while the gay companion of all the sea gods is milling around her. So you can see all the dolphins and everybody just having fun, but kind of mocking the poor Polyphemus on the other side. The typical, the standard sense of beauty of Raphael. He likes these type of faces and this type of position of the face slightly on the side. And virgins, we have again the sense he keeps getting these commissions, but that by now are mostly or soon will be mostly painted by his workshop. But really the type, it's absolutely the paradigm of harmony and balance and how it fits that tondo shape. The Alba Madonna, called because of the Spanish ducal family of Alba who owned it for a century. It was later purchased by the Hermitage in St. Petersburg and then acquired there for the Mellon collection. We can see how the Virgin is already saddened, as you can see, because she knows how Christ is holding the cross that was held by St. John the Baptist. And they both have that vision of the future of Christ. Portraiture was definitely one of the strong areas of Raphael. This extraordinary portrait of Julius II is still one of the one that he made himself, though it exists in 3 versions. In the National Gallery, London, Uffizi, and the Palazzo Pitti in Florence. The London painting is the original. The others are workshop. It's really interesting how it shows. We have the acorn that cap the finials of his chair, and of course, acorn was part of his coat of arms. But we have an old, an aging Pope. He's about a year or so from his end. He's tired. He's been fighting a lot, and he grew a beard because he swore to let his beard grow until he had vanquished a certain family, which never happened, and so his beard went on growing. But though it's very quiet, it's extremely profound and very deep. You can see that look of these tired eyes really reflecting on his accomplishment. Portrait of Bindo Altoviti. He's a Florentine banker and art patron who lived in Rome. And we see here the real grace of that young, very handsome man. The Sistine Madonna was intended to decorate the tomb of Julius II because the Pope Sixtus was the patron saint of the La Rovere family, and Saint Barbara on the other side was his another patron saint. So you have 2 little, and these are probably more known than the rest of the painting. They often be reproduced, these 2 little cherub, these winged genies. They symbolize the funeral ceremony. The canvas was located in the convent of St. Sixtus in Piacenza, was later donated by the monks to Augustus III, King of Savoy. It was carried to Moscow after the Second World War and was later returned to Dresden. So that's another painting that traveled a lot. So at the death of Julius II, we see the arrival of Pope Leo X Medici, together with Cardinals Giulio de' Medici, who is a nephew, and Luigi de' Rossi, another cardinal. He is holding, as you can see, he's holding a book of ours that has now been recognized as the Hamilton Bible. And you see the page, which corresponds almost to the one he has there. He has a magnifier in his hand to help, and then a beautiful silver and gold bell next to the book. The texture of his vestments absolutely extraordinary. And the very stern looking, and then instead of having the acorn of the della Rovere, we have the orange, which was the one part also of the coat of arms of the Medici. He was given by the Pope when Bramante died. He was given then the charge of going on with the plan of the new St. Peter, and we can see the sequence of the main designs for the new St. Peter, where Bramante was stressing a Greek plan, so a central plan for the new church. Raphael changed and made it a more classical design with transepts and just the choir, all want a dome in the center at the crossing, but then he added a nave, giving it more the Latin cross shape, and we'll see later on how these evolve. Even the Michelangelo, which is going to remain good, but be lengthened with a nave to allow more people on the ground. And then he received from the same Pope the commission to make cartoons for tapestries. They were altogether 42 tapestries that would be hung at different moments of the year, depending on the liturgy. This is the series of the Act of the Apostles that has been hung some years ago, exceptionally in the Sistine Chapel, as it used to do for that period of the year. This was, I'm trying to see what the, so this tapestry, as I said, were hung actually last year in February for a week in the Sistine Chapel, and was quite an event. The screen that you see here changed place since that time, so would have altered the position of the tapestry. So we're going to look at it. So when we say cartoon, is the fact he's going to paint on a very large cartoon. He's going to start with the modello, but then he's going to enlarge it life size to what the tapestry size will be. And so these cartoons that he made in Rome, that, as you can see, are the opposite, the mirror image of the tapestry, are then going to be dispatched all the way to Brussels in Northern Europe to be woven by the most known tapestry maker at that time, who was Pieter van Aalst, who had a large workshop in Brussels. And so you can see how, if I rotate the cartoons, it corresponds to this. And it's quite an achievement. Why sending it to Brussels? These were the only place where they could make a work look comparable to the beautiful cartoons of Raphael. By the way, all these cartoons are now the property of the V&A in London, Victoria and Albert Museum. So I'm showing you a few. I'm not going to talk too much about it. You can find these on the net. So this was, the previous one was the Miraculous Rod of Fishes. Here is Paul preaching at Athens with a little tempietto that was built by Bramante. Christ giving the keys to St. Peter. And as you can see with the tapestries, this would have been the end of one. So that would be the end of one side, where it has an additional border and all kind of side stories that have to do with each scene in grisaille at the bottom. The healing of the lame man with the extraordinary tourist column, what you call Solomonic columns, which, by the way, they used to be 4 in the old St. Peter that will be recovered and reused in the new St. Peter. The blindness of Elimas. The death of Ananias. And there are many more. Some of them, most of that series remained in pretty good condition, though, as it is made of fabric, you know, actually there is gold and silver woven in it, so that when the tapestry moves a little bit, you have that shine that comes through. Most of that series remain intact, but many of the tapestries were lost over the centuries. And they almost never come out, by the way. Going on with some more of the works by Raphael, the Santa Cecilia, which has been since transferred from panel to the canvas. So this is when Raphael accompanied Leo X to Bologna to meet the King of France. They went through Florence, and then Leo was, of course, welcomed with great enthusiasm, as he was originally from Florence. And this painting was on that trip, was commissioned to Raphael, showing Santa Cecilia, who is the patron saint of music. So you have all these instruments on the floor reminding you of that. The beautiful Madonna della Seggiola in that extraordinary frame shows again how he's using that round shape to really accommodate the figures. A very intimate view of Mary, Jesus, and Saint John the Baptist with his cross. And of course, the portrait of Baldassare Castiglione, the great writer and diplomat, portraits that is supposedly was painted by the workshop. Raphael had no time at that time to, unfortunately, to make it, but he would design all of them. So he would make a smaller modello, and it would be then copied by the work by some of his best workers. Baldassare Castigliano, a humanist and a writer. This is a portrait that has been a center of inspiration for so many by just the position and the intensity of his gaze. And then many other commissions. Here is the loggia of Pope Leo X, one of the two loggia in the Palazzi Pontifici in the Vatican, where each of these bays were painted with different scenes of the Old Testament and the Genesis. Here are just some examples that can be looked at as being inspired by Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, the separation of land and water, the creation of the animals. And this is another one, the scenes from the life of David. The loggia of Psyche in the Villa Farnesina were painted mostly definitely by his assistant. And we have the four names: Giovanni Daudine, Giulio Romano, Raffaellino del Colle, and Gianfrancesco Pegni. Again, all designed by Raphael, but painted by him. And this is the interesting, it's the Council of God. So that's the whole Olympian host, if you want. All the gods are present at the time that Eros and Psyche explain that they want to get married. So you have river gods, you have Neptune, you have Pluto, and so on, and Hermes. And the banquet of Cupid and Psyche. More portraits. This is a double portrait, probably showing Raphael and a friend of his. And works in the Villa Madama, other beautiful loggia called the Loggia di Raffaello in the villa. I mentioned to you that he had a love, and love was that young woman called La Fornarina because she was the daughter of a baker. And he apparently had a tremendous love for that woman and physical passion for her too. We believe that that other portrait of the woman with a veil is the same person, though that one was painted by Giulio Romano and represents very much the standard for him of female beauty. La Fornarina is really wonderful because that one is painted by Raphael. You can see it's signed on her arm there. It is with that woman that probably did some excesses and that caused his death. The Pope really wanted him to marry, and he had found a lovely woman for him, but Raphael kind of pushed away that marriage because he had ambition to be named cardinal. And then finally, that superb transfiguration that was commissioned by the Cardinal Giulio de' Medici for the Cathedral of Narbonne in France. By that time, Raphael had some problem with his health and never finished the painting completely. It remained, though, after his death in San Pietro in Montorio, and then was taken to Paris in 1797 by Napoleon's troops, and then was brought back to its present location and is in the Vatican now. Again, we have two different levels. We have Christ transfigured in the top with his apostles collapsed on the ground that are blinded by the vision.
I
But
have
we
no
yes.
image. There's no image.
I
just-
have an image. I'm sorry, but it's going to come, hopefully. So we have the lower part, which shows a miracle of that young man who is suffering a mental disease that is cured by the vision of Christ, and with all the other apostles witnessing this incredible scene. It's a superb painting in many ways, by the balance of all that action without having an overcrowded view, and that beautiful figure of Christ elevated in the sky. So I hope you can see it. I'm showing you two of, because there are tons of drawings by Raphael, preparatory drawings, and you can see how detailed they are. Here is one of the disciples that is looking over the shoulders of others to what's happening. And here is St. Andrew holding a book and looking also at what's happening. So when Raphael died, Giorgio Vasari said the painting disappeared with him. When he closed his eyes, she went blind. And that was one of the many said when Raphael died. The life stopped. It was, as I say, a Good Friday. People could not believe that that young, beautiful man and such an artist died. So on his tomb in the Pantheon, he is laying down there next to Maria Bibbiena, who would have become his wife had he lived longer. And the famous poet Pietro Bembo wrote this: "Here lies that famous Raphael by whom nature feared to be conquered while he lived, and when he was dying, feared herself to die." So that was a beautiful verses. Just after his death and following his cartoons, his design, the workshop went on and finished the works in the Stanze with the Sala di Constantino that I'm going to show you very quickly. Here's the Baptism of Constantine. You can see here. The battle at Pons Milvius, of course, where Constantine received the grace of God if he recognized the cross of Christ, and the donation of Rome. So that incredible work in a series of composition that Raphael did, if you just try to put your mind at it, it's incredible how he was able to have that imagination and talent to put together all these designs and allowed his incredible workshop to work quality works. It is, again, so sad to see such a talent die so young, because we can dream of how much more he would have done. So next time we'll see the Theater of the World, exploring nature and human nature. This we're going back to the north for a little while. And okay,